Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're heading deep into the sweltering heat of the Thar Desert to unpack one of the most chilling and honestly, most fascinating mysteries in modern history. We're talking about a thriving, incredibly wealthy community that just seemingly vanished into thin air. They left behind centuries of empty homes, swirling rumors, and a dark curse that still terrifies visitors to this day. We're going to dig into the folklore, the wild paranormal investigations, and finally, the hard, documented history to find out exactly what happened to the village of Kuldhara. To really understand why this place is so legendary, you've got to picture this. It's 2013. It's 2 a.m. in the dead center of the desert. Paranormal investigator Gaurav Tiwari and his team from the Indian Paranormal Society are just wrapping up a long night of exploring. They walk back to their vehicles, and right there, clearly pressed into the thick dust on the hood of their car, are the handprints of a 4- or 5-year-old child. Now, just minutes prior, that car was completely untouched. And here's the truly terrifying part. There wasn't a single child anywhere near them. Actually, there wasn't a single living soul in the entire village, because Kuldhara has been completely empty for 2 centuries. Look, Kuldhara isn't some Hollywood movie set. It is a very real place sitting just 17 kilometers from the city of Jaisalmer in Rajasthan. And today, it's widely known as India's absolute most haunted village. You can literally walk through its sprawling network of streets, past more than 400 abandoned houses, crumbling temples, and dry wells. But you will not find humans. Visitors and locals alike report some genuinely horrifying things here. The sounds of women screaming in the dead of night, sightings of headless apparitions just wandering the ruins, and even, get this, the phantom smell of food being cooked in a completely barren, desolate landscape. The government actually takes this reputation so seriously that tourists are strictly forbidden from remaining in the village after 6 p.m. No exceptions. So, how exactly does a bustling town turn into a forbidden ghost town? Well, let's look at part 1. The Midnight Exodus, a story of a cruel ruler, an ultimatum, and a vanishing act. To really grasp why this massive exodus happened, we have to look at the man who allegedly caused it, Salim Singh. Now, driven by severe childhood trauma and a massive thirst for power, after watching his own father be betrayed and murdered, Singh grew up to become an absolute tyrant. And what's really interesting about this staggering fortune of 20 million rupees is that in the 19th century, that was an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth. Salim Singh amassed all of this by brutally taxing the merchants and farmers of the region until they could barely scrape by. His extortion was so relentless and so effective that he became vastly wealthier and way more powerful than the king of Jaisalmer himself. The king was reduced to little more than a puppet. According to the local legend, this all-powerful tyrant eventually set his sights on Kuldhara. Specifically, he became completely infatuated with the daughter of the village chief. Salim Singh demanded to marry her, but the villagers flat out refused. In response, he delivered a totally chilling ultimatum. Basically, hand the girl over within a day or he would unleash his forces, kidnap her, and slaughter every single person in the village. And remember, the villagers had no standing army. Fighting a man who essentially owned the entire state, it was practically impossible. Left with literally no viable options, the villagers allegedly pulled off the impossible. The myth says that on the night of July 29, 1825, they didn't surrender and they didn't fight. They just vanished. And not just Kuldhara, the residents of 83 surrounding villages joined them. We are talking about 80,000 people leaving 20,000 homes overnight, without making a single sound, without alerting the authorities, just abandoning 600 years of deep history in the desert. And as they left, folklore claims they placed a dark, permanent curse on the land, ensuring that absolutely no one would ever be able to settle in Kuldhara again. Okay, let's dive into this, because to truly grasp the weight of this massive disappearance, we need to ask who these people actually were. Part 2, A Desert Miracle, the story of the Paliwal Brahmins. Migrating to this area way back in the 13th century, they faced brutal summer temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius. I mean, just sweltering. Their secret to survival, though, was a revolutionary, incredibly sophisticated agricultural technique called the Kadeen water harvesting system. They essentially engineered the desert land to capture the unpredictable monsoon rains. The water would flow down the natural slopes and collect in specific designated areas where it would slowly seep deep into the sand over several months. By the time winter arrived and that intense surface heat died down, the soil underneath was incredibly moist and packed with nutrients. This system was so utterly genius that it allowed them to grow 2 lush crops a year right in the middle of a barren desert. It's essentially the agricultural equivalent of farming rice in the Sahara. Because they so completely solved the water problem, Kuldhara flourished into this incredibly wealthy oasis. The Paliwal Brahmins weren't just master farmers, they evolved into expert bankers and financiers. They were strategically located right smack on the vital trade route between Jaisalmer and Sindh, meaning they basically controlled the flow of commerce. This is what made them wealthier than the kings who supposedly ruled over them. They built these magnificent, flawlessly planned homes and intricate stone temples, which honestly makes the folklore even more baffling, right? Why on earth would such an incredibly wealthy, firmly established community just leave everything behind overnight? That massive disconnect between their historical wealth and their sudden disappearance is exactly what fueled the ghost stories for decades. Let's look at part 3, investigating the paranormal, and putting these supernatural claims to the ultimate test. When Gaurav Tiwari and his paranormal team brought all their high-tech equipment into Kuldhara, the results they got were genuinely chilling. Their thermometers recorded these dramatic, hyper-localized temperature drops, plunging to -2 degrees Celsius. Again, right in the middle of a hot desert. Their EMF meters registered intense electromagnetic spikes that seemed to directly respond to the questions they were asking out loud. Motion sensors were being triggered when absolutely nothing was visibly moving around them. Their cameras captured these strange floating orbs, and at one point this dark, ominous shadow appeared on the screen and completely crashed their entire CCTV system. But most terrifyingly of all, their audio equipment actually picked up disembodied screams. They walked away concluding that science simply could not explain what was happening out there. Because these paranormal claims are so intense, researchers have been absolutely desperate to find a rational explanation. In 2017, a scientific journal tried to debunk the Exodus legend entirely by arguing that a massive earthquake actually destroyed the poorly built roofs, tragically killing the residents. But just a year later, a brilliant rebuttal completely dismantled this theory. And this brilliantly illustrates how science course corrects. They proved there were literally 0 earthquakes recorded anywhere near 1825. Furthermore, all the neighboring villages were totally unharmed, and we all know earthquakes don't just target one specific isolated community. But the most striking visual proof of all? Kuldhara's standing walls are still perfectly aligned. There are absolutely no gaps or massive cracks that a devastating earthquake would undoubtedly leave behind. So if it wasn't a paranormal curse, and it wasn't some localized natural disaster, what actually happened? Welcome to part 4, uncovering the historical truth and the real reasons the Paliwal Brahmins fled. Looking past the spooky folklore and digging into the actual preserved historical records maintained by British officers and local historians from that exact era, researchers discovered that Kuldhara was actually hit by a brutal, perfect storm of real-world crises. The very foundation of their desert miracle, the water, began to fail. The nearby Kaka River Dam slowly dried up, completely stopping the recharge of their precious groundwater, which eventually made farming utterly impossible. At the exact same time, the local security infrastructure totally collapsed. Dacoits and ruthless robbers began raiding the town's wealth, frequently kidnapping the village women and holding them for ransom. And instead of stepping in to help them, Diwan Salim Singh just squeezed them even harder, imposing oppressive, extortionate taxes on a population that was rapidly losing its ability to generate any income. So the crucial takeaway here is that we really don't have to guess why they're left. We literally have the receipts. In 1829, a British officer named Colonel James Todd published a detailed record called The Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. He specifically documented that he saw the Paliwal Brahmins living in exile. They weren't cursed, they were actively fleeing. Salim Singh had started taking the family members of these wealthy bankers hostage just to exert financial control over them. The exodus was a desperate, fully documented escape from an unlivable, violent tyranny. This historical data completely shatters the most famous part of the legend, the overnight vanishing. It simply never happened. Just look at the timeline. At its peak, Kuldhara housed over 1,500 people. But by 1815, a full decade before the legendary 1825 disappearance, the population had already halved down to about 800. The water was drying up, and people were already quietly packing up and leaving for better prospects in places like Jodhpur in Bihar. And incredibly, records show that by 1890, which is decades after the village supposedly vanished forever, there were still 37 people stubbornly living in Kuldhara. So actually, scratch that whole magical midnight disappearance. It was a slow, agonizing migration. But that brings us to a really glaring question. Part 5, Treasures and Psychological Tricks. If history proves beyond a doubt that this was a gradual, normal migration, why on earth do people experience ghosts out there today? A huge piece of the puzzle is a very powerful psychological mechanism called confirmation bias. When you walk through the old stone gates of a place that the entire internet, the locals, and the official tourism boards explicitly call India's most haunted village, your brain is heavily primed. You fully expect to be scared. So when the wind howls through a broken window or a piece of electronic equipment glitches out, your brain doesn't rationally think, oh, that's just wind, or oh, a battery glitch. It instantly searches for information that confirms the terrifying story you've been fed. It thinks ghost. Combine that with pareidolia, which is basically our brain's desperate hardwired need to find recognizable patterns, especially human faces, in completely random stimuli. You look at shadows shifting across centuries-old ruins, and your brain immediately stitches those vague shapes into a headless apparition. It's fascinating, too, that local officials and guides who have been visiting the ruins for over 25 years without buying into the hype report absolutely zero supernatural encounters. The magic, it seems, really requires you to believe in it first. But wait, because there is one final brilliant twist to this whole story. Who actually started all these modern ghost rumors in the first place? Well, the real ghosts of Kuldhara were just humans blinded by greed. Because the Paliwal Brahmins were historically so incredibly wealthy, persistent rumors swirled that they had buried gold and silver beneath the floors of their homes before fleeing. In the 1990s, treasure hunters flocked to the ruins. But to dig up the stone floors in secret, they needed to make absolutely sure the locals stayed far, far away after dark. So these thieves deliberately manufactured and actively spread these terrifying ghost stories to use as a cover for their literal crimes. And we know this for an absolute fact. In 1998, a local watchman named Sumer Ram was staying in the ruins when he literally caught a Dutch and a German tourist armed with metal detectors aggressively digging up the floor of one of the ancient houses. And they had actually found hidden gold and silver coins. When he boldly confronted them, one of the thieves actually pulled a knife on him. Thankfully, Sumer Ram managed to get away and call the police. The thieves were promptly arrested, and those stolen, deeply historical coins sit locked in the custody of the Jaisalmer court to this very day. It was only after this wild incident that the government finally built a boundary wall to protect the site. So, what is the real legacy of Kuldhara? The ghost stories are undeniably fun. They definitely drive tourism, and they make for a fantastic, spooky narrative around a campfire. But the truth is so much more magnificent. This was a highly resilient, absolute genius community of farmers and bankers who defied the harshest desert on Earth, engineered a literal agricultural miracle, and thrived for 600 years until raw nature and human greed finally forced them out. So, the next time you hear about Kuldhara, will you think of the imaginary ghosts haunting the shadows, or will you think of the incredible human ingenuity that literally turned the sand into gold? That's all for this explainer. Keep questioning the legends, and I'll catch you next time.